Linen is a material that has a reputation for being difficult to work with. The archaeological record shows that linen is among some of the first fibers that we used when we first started weaving thousands of years ago. If linen is so historically significant, then why does it get such a bad rap with modern weavers? In this video, I'll talk about some of the challenges that weavers face when working with linen and some strategies to help make weaving with linen a little less daunting. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Linen comes from the flax plant, which is a grass, and it's actually the inner core of the plant. This is the part of the plant that's responsible for transporting water and nutrients all the way from the roots to the leaves of the plant. Once the flax plant is harvested, then it's retted. This is an old word that means rotted, and it can be done in any number of ways. It can be done chemically, it can be done with water, it can be done with fungus, or a bunch of different ways. But what it does is it allows the outer part of the grass to break down, and then this is scraped away through several processes, including breaking, scutching, and hackling. These gradually refine the plant, the grass, into strong, lustrous fiber that's ready to spin. The higher quality your linen yarn tends to mean that there's less of that outer barky material that's kind of scratchy left in the yarn. The inner core of the flax plant is really strong. It has to be to stand up to all those processes, but it's not that stretchy. Think of grass. Grass isn't stretchy, it's a plant. It's not elastic. So that characteristic is going to translate into your yarn. It's really important to understand that because that helps you understand how the yarn is going to behave. Most weavers' frustrations with linen yarn come down to two factors. Its lack of elasticity leads to inconsistent tension, and it's prone to breakage due to abrasion. Managing these factors are really key to weaving with linen successfully. Starting with a shorter warp can be a great way to work with linen. Generally, when there's an inconsistency in your warp tension, it tends to get worse over time. A loose thread gets looser and looser and looser, and if there's a bunch of these in your warp, that can lead to a lot of headaches. Working with a shorter warp will help to minimize this problem, and if you do run into major issues and have to scrap the project, a shorter warp will also mean less wasted yarn. As you're winding your warp, you want to measure it with precise and even tension. Note that you don't want to warp tightly, as this can damage or even break your warping board, but you do want to place each thread exactly next to its neighbor. This ensures that each warp end is exactly the same length. If you're not placing threads precisely, some will be going in straight lines and some will be going in diagonal lines, and that will mean that the diagonals actually have more length to them, and this is going to lead to some of those inconsistencies later on in your warp. The next thing that you can do with linen is to size your warp. There are many different ways that you can size your warp. You can do it on the loom, you can do it off the loom, you can do it after you've woven your warp chain or before you've done it. There are many different recipes for sizing that you can use for your warp, and a lot of times it will just be something that you might have in your kitchen, such as flax seeds combined with water or a vegetable starch of some kind. The common denominator with all the recipes and the methods is that sizing is essentially a glue that later washes out when you're done weaving. It coats down any hairy ends that might make the yarn more prone to abrasion, and it also acts as an extra layer of protection against abrasion. Most people don't consider sizing an essential step for most warps, but in cultures where linen weaving is still commonly practiced, sizing is often seen as just another step. It's nothing to be ashamed of, it's not cheating, it's just something that you can use to make weaving go easier for you. If you feel a little bit scared by weaving with linen yarn, I'd recommend that you try sizing your warp as a way to just give you a little bit of extra peace of mind. Warping back to front is also a great strategy for warping with linen. In this method, the yarn is wound onto the back beam, then pulled through the heddles and the reed. This means that there's only one time that each piece of yarn travels through the heddles and the reed, and the heddles and the reed are going to be your biggest sources for abrasion. If you're new to warping back to front, I have a whole video on that topic. The link should appear up above here, and also it's down in the description. Linen is a lot more sensitive to humidity than other yarns. That makes sense when we think back to what it actually is, the xylem and the phloem that carries water and nutrients to the rest of the plant. Of course it's going to react to water. When linen is wet or in a humid environment, it relaxes, and it's actually at its most elastic in this state. At an industrial level, linen is usually woven at 70 to 80% relative humidity in order to reduce breakage. Hand weavers have all sorts of tricks to add humidity at home in order to help reduce breakage. One easy trick is just to add a humidifier, or to make sure you're not weaving next to a heat source such as an air vent that's blasting heat, or your wood stove or something like that. Not everybody finds this essential. Peggy Osterkamp is a weaving teacher and author, and she says that she doesn't do a ton of extra work with linen. Yeah, she's making sure to wind her warp evenly with a consistent tension. She's winding it back to front, but then when she goes to tie on the warp, she just mists it lightly with a little spray bottle. Then she weaves her header, and that header will take up some of those inconsistencies in the individual yarns, and then she just weaves away and finds that the rest of the warp will be relatively well behaved. Some people do a little bit more, laying damp towels across their warp to get the maximum humidity, but I would caution you against getting your warp too wet, especially if you're using a metal reed. When weaving linen was still a very common occupation, looms were still made entirely of wood. And that included the reeds, and the heddles would have been made of string. So adding moisture to that environment wasn't such a big deal. Now that most weavers tend to use metal reeds, adding too much moisture to a warp can really run the risk of rusting out your really expensive reed. And that's also going to be a problem when you're weaving with linen, because a rusty reed is going to add even more abrasion. So do make sure that you're protecting your investment of your reed and keeping that nice and dry. As you weave, every time you beat your weft into place, you're abrading your warp just a little bit. This happens the most at the selvages, but it can happen all across your warp too, especially if you're working with a really densely set warp. If you advance your warp often, keeping your weaving in that nice sweet spot, you'll minimize the abrasion and you'll kind of spread it out more evenly, and that can help you to reduce breakage. If you do end up with the occasional loose warp thread, you can just add some weight to it. I keep this box of S-hooks in my weaving room. Anytime I've got a loose warp thread, I'll just take my S-hook and I'll find that warp thread and I'll hook it in and then just drop it off the back of the loom. Sometimes on really tricky warps, I can have lots of those going across. If I need to add more weight to one particular warp thread, I can just hook two S-hooks together, or I've got some bigger S-hooks in here. So I can really manage this really easily with things that I find just at the hardware store. On any warp, you're going to get the most abrasion at the selvages, especially if you have a significant amount of draw-in. Using a temple is a great way to control draw-in, and it also gives you the benefit of having a little bit less abrasion at those edges and less potential for breakage. For any time you're using linen weft, there are a couple other things that you ought to know. Using an even beat is really important with linen. Because it's so stiff, it tends to show an uneven beat more than other fibers will. Being sure to advance your warp often also helps with this factor. Because linen is such a stiff material when it's new, it has a reputation for wanting to just jump off bobbins. And this can happen at an inconsistent rate, and it's hard to predict. This is one of the reasons that people find working with linen a little bit difficult or challenging. The first strategy for dealing with this quirk is just to wind your bobbins really evenly. This is a great standard practice overall, but it's even more important when working with linen. Some people like to take this a step further and they actually wet their linen wefts prior to weaving. The idea is that we're taking advantage of that elasticity and that relaxation of linen when it's wet, and it helps the fibers bend more easily around the selvages. If you're going to do this, be sure to use plastic bobbins like the ones that Shact makes, and don't leave your weft soaking for too long. Even though linen has antifungal and antibacterial properties, it is a natural material. It will decompose. You probably don't want bobbins full of moldy or musty linen. As you're weaving, you want to keep an even tension on your warp, but not too much. I know the temptation is to just crank your warp to the tightest tension possible to get that perfect shed, but when you do that with linen, it's going to make it more prone to breaking. It's also going to put more stress on your loom because that linen yarn lacks elasticity. Try letting your linen warp be just a tiny bit looser than you want and see how it does. When you're done weaving for the day, be sure and let a little bit of tension off of your loom. You want the warp to be relaxed. This is a good best practice in general, but it's especially important with linen because of how sensitive it is to moisture, especially if you've been wetting your warp or adding humidity in some way. As that warp dries out, it's going to shrink back into place, and that can put extra strain on your loom. I've even heard stories of back beams cracking in the middle of the night because of a wide warp of linen yarns just drying and shrinking until the wood just couldn't take it anymore. And that's just not something anybody wants to have happen to them. So always be sure to relax your warp at the end of a weaving session, especially if you're working with linen as your warp. Up to now, we've been talking about techniques that you can use to manage linen's susceptibility to abrasion and its inelasticity. But there's one more factor that can really make a difference in your weaving experience, and that's the loom itself. Because of where loom technology was when linen was at its peak of production in the world of weaving and commerce, linen was traditionally woven on counterbalance and countermarch looms. These looms lift and lower all the threads every time a treadle is pressed, and that keeps a more consistent tension across all the warp threads. If you're weaving on this type of loom, you might just have an easier time with linen. A jack style loom, in contrast, only lifts the threads on the selected shafts. This places more tension on the threads being lifted than on the threads that are not being lifted. A similar mechanism happens when you're working with a rigid heddle loom. If you're planning on working with linen on one of these types of looms, don't worry, it can still be done. Every single linen warp that I have ever made has been done on a jack style loom. It's totally possible. But you might find that some of the tips and tricks that I mentioned earlier in the video are just all that much more important when you're working on a jack loom. Linen fabric is truly gorgeous, and unlike other fabrics, it only gets better and more beautiful with wear. I really hope that this video has encouraged you to tackle warping with linen. And if you have any comments or additional suggestions, don't forget to drop them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.